Did you know that the USA is actually the third best country in the history of the sport of Olympic weightlifting? It's actually just behind the Soviet Union and China. Now, if you're somewhat familiar with the sport of weightlifting, this is a bit of a surprising news because US weightlifting really hasn't produced any Olympic champion caliber athletes in basically over 60 years. So this obviously changed last year with Olivia Reeves winning the Olympics in the 71 kilo category. But before that, we had one Olympic champion in 2000, which was Tara Knott, which was actually originally a silver medalist and promoted to a gold medalist following the positive test of the original Olympic champion. Before that, you have to go back to 1956 and Paul Anderson gold medal. But really, where American weightlifting started to shine would be just before the World War. Just before the war, John Davis will become the first black world champion in the history of weightlifting while a teenager. He'll then remain 15 years undefeated, but the reason why he remained undefeated for this long is in big part the Second World War, of course. Now, the Second World War not only favorizing John Davis, also favorized a lot of the American athletes. While Europe was the biggest powerhouse in the sport of weightlifting before the Second World War, none of the athletes were obviously able to train or compete or do anything related to the sports, and the countries as a whole just couldn't do anything. The effort was put on the war and that's it. But in the US, it was a bit of a different situation, obviously. The World War wasn't happening on their territory, and so because of that, come 1948, we'll see the very first American Olympic champion of the modern style of weightlifting. His name was Frank Spellman and he competed at 75 kilos. Now, he wasn't a very notable lifter by any mean. Of course, he was an Olympic champion, which is always notable, but he wasn't nearly on the caliber of future Olympic champions from the US. So, Olympic champions from the US will have, first of all, John Davis, that I mentioned earlier. He will remain undefeated for 15 years. He will be the first person to officially break the 400 pounds barrier in competition in the clean and jerk. And overall, he'll just be an absolute legend of the sport at the time. Quickly followed by him, we'll see guys like Tommy Kono, Norbert Szymanski, that will kind of crush every expectations that you could have from a lifter. They will both become multiple times Olympic medalists, both break multiple records in multiple weight classes, and both of their careers lasted actually a pretty long time. Apart from these three, we have maybe the man that became the first official world's strongest man, if you could say that, the first man that was really known all throughout the world, including the Soviet Union, as the strongest man to ever live. It was Paul Anderson. So Paul Anderson had a lot of accolade to his name. He did a lot of great things, a lot of great feats of strength, obviously, but mainly he was Olympic champion in 1956. He was also supposed to become Olympic champion in 1960, according to him at least, obviously, but come the Olympics, he wasn't allowed to compete. The reason for that was that in between the 56 and 60 Olympics, he had done what would be considered as professional sports, so he was paid for his performances, and that disqualified him from taking part in the Olympics. Because of this, his rival of the time, Yuri Vlasov, will become the first man ever to clean and jerk 200 kilos, so he did 202 at the 1960 Olympics. And to me, this kind of marked the beginning of the end of American weightlifting. From the 60s, the early 60s onward, we'll see a true development of the sport of weightlifting as a whole, not only in the Soviet Union, but also in a lot of the neighboring states, including Bulgaria, Poland, countries of this caliber that ended up becoming the biggest countries of weightlifting. In the US, though, we had a little bit of a different situation. So with the utter dominance of the Eastern Bloc, most of the top athletes, the strongest men, just kind of stopped doing weightlifting and focused on other sports, including professional sports, of course. And because of this, we won't see any Olympic champion for the US in almost 70 years. Now, we had a little bit of a burst of medal at the Olympics, which was in 1984. But the reason was that in 1980, the US boycotted the Moscow Olympics. And because of that, in 1984, the entire Eastern blocs will also boycott the Olympics that were at this time held in Los Angeles, so LA 84. As mentioned, it just so happened that all of the best countries of the sport of weightlifting were in the Eastern Bloc, and because of this we had pretty low performances by every metric possible, which allowed 2 American lifters to take a medal, which of course we're not taking away from them. They earned their medal fair and square, but it just doesn't have the same value in the grand scheme of things as the medal of Paul Anderson, for example. When the sport of weightlifting started to be competed in by women, it was a little bit of a rebirth of American weightlifting in a way. So men's were obviously still competing, still taking part on the biggest stages, but just more so at the bottom of the sessions than at the top. On the women's side though, it was going pretty well. Every World Championships had some kind of American medalists, and come the 2000 Olympics, when women were finally allowed to compete in the sport of weightlifting, we will see the first American medalist on the women's side, which was, as mentioned a little bit earlier, Tara Knott, which was later promoted to the gold medal following a positive test. Just as a little point here, it's kind of interesting to know that the very first Olympic champion on the very first women's session ever was popped. Now, in the following years, all throughout the 2000s, all of the medals from the US will be from women's lifter. I'm particularly thinking about the super heavyweight categories, and more especially about Sarah Robles, that earned multiple Olympic medals in the super heavyweight ranks. While she wasn't obviously on the level of the Chinese and the Russians, she was the 3rd best most of the time, just behind this behemoth, and that's definitely worth mentioning. Now, what I consider and many consider as the beginning of the true rise of US weightlifting would be the birth of CrossFit. So CrossFit appeared, if I'm not mistaken, in the mid-2000s, and it gained in popularity pretty quick, meaning that right around the 2010s, something like this, people were starting to practice CrossFit. In CrossFit there are weightlifting movements, and people attending to CrossFit had kids, their kids started to do CrossFit, and because of CrossFit they started to do weightlifting. And because of this we had a massive general influx into the sport of weightlifting in the US. Now, while it's hard to say that this is the only reason why US weightlifting is starting to develop the way it is right now, it's a reason. Other reasons, of course, would be better and better coaching, higher and higher investments into the sport by the federation, better support for the athletes, things like this. And all of this meant that starting at the Tokyo Olympics, we had our first real contender on the men's sides, but also real contenders on the women's side. So we had Kate Vibert that medaled pretty much unexpectedly. We also had guys like CJ Cummings, which gave a shot at a medal lift. And then we had Paris. So Paris was the true start of what I consider being maybe the next great superpower of the sport of weightlifting, with very strong lifters in almost every single category on both the men's and the women's side. The most obvious one would be Hampton Morris, which is the only man and the only American overall to break a world record in the sport of weightlifting in right around 55 years. He was just 20 years old when he did this, and just a few months later he became the first legit Olympic medalist on the men's side since, as mentioned, 1956. And then we had Olivia Reeves, which is an Olympic champion from the USA, which 8 years ago would have been impossible to even consider. Now, the future is looking very bright for Team USA. We have many talents. We have many talented lifters that are coming up, like Kadenka Hoy, for example, very promising lifter, and one of my favorite lifters currently, Colby Ferguson, that'll be competing at Pan Am's very soon. That was pretty much the full story of American weightlifting. Let me know what you think.